Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I am the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today, once again, in fact, by Thom Hartmann. He is the country's leading progressive radio host. He is also the best-selling author of over 24 books, including, most recently, the book we are here to talk about today, The Hidden History of American Democracy, Rediscovering Humanity's Ancient Way of Living. Thom Hartmann, thank you so much for returning to Current Affairs.
Hey, Nathan, thanks so much for inviting me. It's great to be here with you again.
So, I think this is, did I count correctly? Is this number 9 in the Hidden History series?
It is.
Okay, so congratulations on number 9. I want to start, before we talk about this particular one, by talking about the series, because, I was thinking about it, and, I want to talk in particular about why you write history, specifically, because you could, as a progressive commentator, just write a book about American healthcare. You could write a book about neoliberalism. You could write a book just about democracy today, and you do in these books, but they are hidden histories. So why is it that you've approached all of the subjects you've approached, from monopoly to healthcare to guns to voting, through hidden history?
Through the lens of history. I think that you can't understand the present if you don't understand the past. Mm-hmm. And I mean, there's an old saying that's sometimes attributed to Hitler, I believe, he who controls the past controls the present, he who controls the future. And there have been a lot of attempts to rewrite the past of American history and to reinvent the founders as Christian fundamentalists or as, obscenely wealthy people who were just, out for themselves or whatever. Those are memes and stories that satisfy certain special interest groups, but they're not true. In each one of these books, I go back to original sources and, try to ground the understanding of the present and understanding of how this present came about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Actually, there is a blurb on this latest book from Current Affairs, the magazine I run, and I'll just read it. Hartmann's Hidden History series of books fills the gaps in American history textbooks, showing the dark side of American healthcare, law, policing, and more. But actually, I realized as I was reading that on the cover of your book that it's not quite correct, or at least it is incomplete, because it says here, and what I said was that it shows the dark side of American healthcare, law, policing, and more, which is true. But as I was reading this book, you also show things that this country has to be proud of that we forget or are excluded from our narratives, models that we should go back and look at and remember.
Yeah, absolutely. This country was founded in an extraordinary experiment and in defiance of the world's most powerful nation, the world's most powerful army and navy, and based on a series of principles that were considered radical and untested. And in fact, the Greek democracy failed, and the Roman Republic failed, turned into an autocracy. So there was a lot of skepticism early on, and many of the founders were idealists that I think that, frankly, we should be very proud of in some regards.
Yeah, actually, just before I get more into the democracy stuff, I want to ask you one kind of meta question, or a question about the way that you write these books, not just this one, but the whole series. One of the things Ralph Nader says on this book is that you are someone who knows how to communicate to everyone. And, obviously you've been very successful in radio. I think a lot about, how to communicate to people. Could you tell us a little more about how not only do you try and excavate this history, but these are not, I don't want to say they're not academic books in a way that makes them sound simplistic, but they're books that are intended to make history accessible. And how do you do that?
Yeah, back long ago and far away, I used to own an advertising agency, and I attended a number of seminars over the years on how to learn how to run an ad agency and do that sort of thing. And one that I attended was by a guy named Joe Sugarman, who at the time was the highest paid copywriter in America. This was back in the early 70s. And Joe said that his strategy for writing copy, advertising copy, was to always imagine a person that he knows, that he cares about, and that he knows would have an interest in the subject that he was going to write about, and to essentially write his copy as a letter to a friend. And I adopted that. I adopted that for writing advertising copy. And then when I started writing books, I adopted it for writing my books. So most chapters in most of my books, and in some cases an entire book, are actually written to a person. And sometimes I'll even, after I write a chapter, send it to that person. Sometimes I'll start it out with a dear David, let me tell you about this. And then when I'm all done, I'll get rid of the dear David. It kind of tricks your mind into writing in a very conversational fashion. And it makes your writing very accessible. So it's one of those little writer's tricks or tools or whatever you want to call it, that I've found very helpful.
But I emphasize this because I feel like it's particularly important for those of us who are on the left. And I think we talked about this a bit last time in regard to radio, that conservatives, I read a lot of their books. I just published a book called Responding to the Right, where I had to read a lot of conservative books. They're very, very good at packaging their talking points. They're actually quite good and clear writers. And what I noticed, I don't want to say, I noticed reading this that you write like a conservative, but I mean that what I mean is that you clearly think about some of the things that they think about, which is like, how do I make it so that any person on the street can pick up my book and read it and get what I'm saying?
Well, that's my goal. I didn't write these books for academics or for even history buffs. When Louise and I first came up with the idea, we noted, and this was 5 years ago, and then pitched it to our publisher, Barrett Kohler. We had both noticed that we were just not reading large books anymore. And, because we just don't have the time. I mean, life has become so busy. And plus, you've got all these other things demanding your time. Your phone is constantly demanding attention, and, social media and work and everything else. And so Louise had come up with this idea. She called them rainy day books, a book that's small enough to basically read on a rainy day, on a Saturday. And that became these books. None of them are longer than about 165, 170 pages. And, and it's not tiny type, but they're also not just skeletal. There's real
you got a lot of
endnotes. I've written a lot of 60. Yeah. And I've written a lot of 60 and 80 and 100,000 word books. And what I find is, I've had publishers come back and say, we need another 15,000 words to bulk this book up. And, I hate doing that. I didn't have to do that with any of these books. This is just the stuff you need to know.
Well, and, those of us who want to see changes in society, those of us who believe in a progressive future, since the time of Thomas Paine, obviously the pioneer of the pamphlet, right? I mean, did common sense have to be 80,000 words? No.
Exactly. And that, and George Washington credited Thomas Paine with starting the Revolutionary War.
It's succinct, it's punchy, it gets its points across. And as I look back, history, I see lots of, I've been reading for an article I'm writing, like old leftist literature of like the 20s and 30s and the 1910s, where they put together these, a lot of little pamphlets and these called these blue books and little things that were trying to take sophisticated ideas and not compromise the sophistication, but make them, really easy for everyone to get.
That was definitely my goal. And I think, the feedback I'm getting, it seems that it's working.
Well, we're on book 9.
A lot of just average books. Yeah, there you go.
No, I know. And so let's get into a little more the hidden history of American democracy. An earlier response you were talking about, going back to the radical experiment that was the American founding. And in the first part of your book, you talk about how that radical experiment, which is often, considered to draw from the great European philosophers Locke and Rousseau and Montesquieu and so forth, had, a lot of sources, a lot of intellectual sources of inspiration that aren't often discussed.
Yeah, and it's kind of a statement about how Eurocentric our worldview is and our historical worldview. The first story that we typically tell ourselves about where our democracy came from is that, we are emulating the Greeks or the Romans. And in fact, the Greeks had something closer to a direct democracy. And, like I said, it ultimately didn't work out. Socrates, in fact, played a role in destroying it. And then, the Roman Republic, it had a Senate, but there's a lot of differences between the Roman Republic and the American form of government. This was really a unique experiment. And so the notion that democracy is the default state of humanity is kind of my starting point with this. And just to back up a little bit, and then I'll come back around where the ideas came from. Some years ago, a decade or so ago, couple of British scientists, Conrad and Roper, hypothesized that if that we were anthropomorphizing animals in a way that was causing us not to really understand how they engaged in decision making. That we viewed the animal world as kingdoms, in fact, we call it the animal kingdom.
Right.
That there's alpha animals, and the alpha animal is the one who makes all the decisions. And, just like the king makes all the decisions. And they said, you're going to find that that's not true, that the alpha animals will probably have first choice of sexual partner, which comports with, Darwin's idea of natural selection, passing along the strongest genes. But that's it. And so they published this, and James Randerson, I believe his name was, and a few other scientists decided to do a deep dive into this. And there was this herd of red deer near the University at Essex. And they put cameras in the trees and were tracking the deer. And, what's the deal here? How do they make decisions?
Sure.
Because there are alpha animals among deer. And what they found was that when it kind of got, they were out grazing, and eventually they have to go to one of these three watering holes, and different deer would point their bodies at different one of the three watering holes. And when 51% of the deer were pointing at one of the watering holes, all the other deer would form together into a herd and right to that watering.
Yeah, direct democracy.
It's democracy, exactly. It turns out that hyenas do this by sneezing. They actually sneeze as a vote, and they count the votes. And it requires a 51% threshold. So anyhow, I called up Ken Conrad, one of these researchers, and I said, what happened when you published this? And he said, I heard from people in other disciplines. He said, a bug guy, an entomologist, called and said, we've been doing slow motion photography on gnats, or balls of gnats. You see a ball of gnats, and it's just kind of hanging there in the air, and then it moves like 3 feet to the left. How do they know to do that? Are they psychic? No, it turns out that with every wing beat, they're voting. And they're constantly, in real time, they're continuously voting and continuously counting the vote. A fish guy called up and said this accounts for schooling behavior, every motion of their bodies. Yeah. I always thought they had to be telepathic, because there's not a lead fish who's saying, okay, guys, time to turn left. Yeah. I mean, at least with geese, it sounds like somebody's giving orders, right? But, it's not happening with fish. It turns out that every motion of their body is a vote. And when, 51% of them move 3 degrees to the right, the whole school of fish goes 3 degrees to the right. Same thing with birds. And it turns out that from the smallest insects to primates, you find this almost as a universal across the animal kingdom, that decisions are made democratically. So if you start with that premise, you would expect that human societies that had not within the previous 1,000 or 2,000 years been conquered, the human societies that had literally millennia for trial and error experimentation about the best way to live, would in most cases end up choosing a democratic form of governance. And when you go back and you read like Peter Farb's Man's Rise to Civilization, it was published in the 1960s, where he looks at first contact with, I think it was 34 Native American tribes in the 1600s. The majority of them were democratic, and the ones that weren't, there were a couple that were tyrannical, but some of the others had really elaborate structures to avoid hierarchy. Like there was a community down in what is now New Orleans, the mound builders, pyramid builders. And they had a caste system with 4 classes. The top one was the sun gods, and the bottom one was the stinkards. And I don't remember the middle two. But they had a rule that your children, each child had to marry somebody who was 2 classes away from themselves. So every family had all 4 classes within it, which produced essentially a classless society, although there was, segregation or a definition of status and job function. So anyhow, to get back to where did John Locke get his ideas? If, it was the Romans and the Greeks idea fails, then we default to, it was other white Europeans. It must have been Locke and Rousseau and Montesquieu and Hobbes and whatnot. And it turns out that in the early 1700s, the French trappers were making just great inroads into the eastern part of the Midwest, eastern or western New York State and Pennsylvania, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, that area. And those French trappers brought with them the French Jesuits as the evangelists to the Indians. And one particular tribe, the Hurons, actually welcomed them, accepted them. They did a lot of trading with them. And every year from the 1710s or 20s, the year is in my book, I don't recall it exactly, for about 40 or 50 years, every year, these French missionaries would write a long, like 70, 80, 100-page long summary of their year with the Indians, living with the savages. And they described these democratic societies that lived in peace and harmony with themselves and with their neighbors. They had no police, they had no prisons, they had no rich people, they had no poor people, and yet there was no, giant law enforcing all these things. How did they do this? And these became major bestsellers in Europe, first in France, and then by the 1730s and 1740s, they were being translated into Dutch and German and English. And this then kind of collided with another fad that was going on in France at the time, which was something called salons, where wealthy women with large houses would invite famous speakers to their home and invite the local upper class to come and hear these speakers. And because there was such a buzz about these Huron leaders, about this form of governance, basically the Iroquois confederacy, there was all this demand to see the Hurons. And so the French missionaries organized a couple of trips where some of these Huron leaders who had learned to speak French fluently traveled across the seas to France and spoke in these salons. And in fact, John Locke, in a footnote to one of his books, actually talks about attending one of these. So it turns out that the ideas of the Enlightenment, the democratic ideas of the Enlightenment, were really derived from the Hurons via the French to the American colonists. Now, there were some, among the founders, in fact, many of them, who had direct contact with Native Americans and knew them well, in particular, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams. And Jefferson's father was a map maker in Virginia. He traveled all over the state. Most of the state, about half the state at that time, was Indian country. And he spoke several different Indian languages. And Thomas traveled with him, and the Indians used to come to their home to Shadwell. John Adams, he and Jefferson have correspondences, which are in the book later in life, where Adams talks about the Indians who lived near him and that he used to play with as children. And Ben Franklin, for a good third of his life, was the U.S. government's envoy to several different Native American tribes, and really loved them. His famous saying, if 5 nations of ignorant savages have been able to forge a bond that has lasted in peace for 1,000 years, then certainly 13 colonies of educated Englishmen can do the same. So, and in fact, he used Native American iconography for our early currencies, for the early American currency, and for his arguments for democracy and for America. So that's really where the ideas came from, in large part.
Yeah,
is the Native American, and again, because they had not been conquered at that point. They were literally, what you were looking at was 10,000 years of trial and error, 18,000 years in North America, whereas in Europe, 3,000 years ago, the Celts came through and organized Europe in trading systems. 2,000 years ago, the Romans came through and conquered Europe and imposed their own language on it. 1,000 years ago, the Catholics came across and conquered Europe and banned all the old religions and most of the old languages. And so, the Europeans had kind of lost track of their ancient tribal roots. Jefferson was fascinated by this idea, the Whig histories. Paul de Rapin de Terrasse, his History of England, published in 1727, was about the tribal British, the red-haired tribal British. But I'm wandering off here. Sorry.
Well, I mean, and obviously the story of the native inhabitants of this continent is ultimately a tragic one, in which these early democracies and confederacies are destroyed. But, I think that this hidden side of the history that you tell is so important. And a lot of, I know that you cite, some of the path-breaking work that the late David Graeber and David Wenger did in Dawn of Everything, in bringing to light, the level of sophistication politically and intellectually of these societies that, as they were ultimately destroyed, so was their history, to the point where we do now look at, or the typical story of the United States is the story of these Enlightenment European intellectuals experimenting with inventing democracy in this continent. But of course, they are in some ways inspired by the democracy that is already on this continent.
That's right, that they conquered. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
It's extraordinary.
And Wenger and Graeber did a great job with that, with Dawn of Everything. I mean, it's a marvelous book.
David Graeber's death was just a terrible, terrible loss. I mean, one of our most interesting...
I agree. He had been a guest on my program multiple times.
I don't know anyone who had, more original ideas, right? It's just so... Yeah. It's so fascinating. You wonder what he would have come up with. Well, I want to talk about, one of the other early myths that you challenge and destroy in this book is the myth of the United States as this Christian country, which I think is from its origins, which I think is so important to remind people of, as you say, the secular origin of America, especially at a time when, we always have politicians on the right trying to turn this country into, well, a pretty outright theocracy, right?
Yeah. The founders were, in the 1700s, they still had a clear recollection of not just the Salem witch trials. I mean, those were kind of the tip of the iceberg. But, that whole situation, John Greenleaf Whittier's poem, The Women Came from Dover, which takes place long after the Salem witch trials, where women were just routinely stripped and whipped, publicly for witchcraft or just simply for talking back, Massachusetts almost was not allowed into the Union because they still had laws that required taxation for the churches and compulsory or Sunday church attendance. There were some fanatical Christians among the founders. Patrick Henry was probably the most well-known. He was the richest guy, or one of the richest guys in Virginia. He was the largest slave owner in Virginia. He had over 360 enslaved people that he owned. He was a fairly brutal slave master.
Ironic that he's known for give me liberty or give me death.
Extremely ironic, yeah. And he also was not a fan of the Constitution. I mean, at the Virginia Ratifying Convention, this is in my book on guns and the Second Amendment, he was the one who said that the Second Amendment originally said for the security of a free nation. And he forced Madison to change that for the security of a free state in order to protect the slave patrol in Virginia, which was Virginia's militia, because the Second Amendment is all about militia. But they were very clear that they did not want theocracy. They had seen how, what a disaster it had been in England with the English Revolution. They had seen, or the Civil War, they had seen what a disaster it was in New England. Madison and Hamilton, or excuse me, Madison and Jefferson, in fact, Madison was Jefferson's protege. And they had a kind of a running dialogue for years about the danger of theocracy. Jefferson was convinced that if a priest ever became president, or if a bunch of ministers and priests became senators and representatives, it would be the end of the republic. Madison was not so concerned about that, but he was very concerned that if the federal government ever got involved with religion, it would be the end of the religion. Jefferson was not a Christian, he was a deist, but Madison was a Christian and a church-going Christian. And in fact, it turns out they were both right. Madison's first veto when he took office as president in 1809 was to veto a piece of legislation that would have sustained George Washington's first socialist experiment, which was a poorhouse in Washington, D.C. for indigent people that provided them with medical care and food and clothing and housing. And in 1809, there was this minor religious revival going on, and Congress sent him a law that ran that money through a local church. And Madison vetoed that, saying this would establish a very bad precedent. He was absolutely right. There's also a great quote from Jefferson. If you've got the time for me to read you a paragraph or two, it's so brilliant. If you go to the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., you'll see carved on the wall, "I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny imposed upon the mind of men," which is a quote from Thomas Jefferson. And that's the quote that the Bible thumpers today always point to and say, see, Thomas Jefferson swearing on the altar of God against tyranny. Yes, he was a Christian. What's missing is the actual letter that it came from. And this is just one long paragraph, but here it is. He was writing to a friend of his, Ben Rush, just a month before he was elected president in 1800. And this whole issue of whether he was a Christian or not was swirling around. It had become an issue in the election. And so Jefferson writes to his friend, and Ben Rush was also a deist, "I do not know, however, that it would reconcile the genus irritable vetum," the angry priests, "who are all in arms against me. Their hostility is on too interesting a ground to be softened. The delusions into which the XYZ plot showed it possible to push the people on the clause of the Constitution, which, while it secured the freedom of the press," he's talking about the First Amendment here, "covered also the freedom of religion, has given to the clergy a very favorite hope of obtaining an establishment of a particular form of Christianity throughout the United States. And as every sect believes its own to be the one true one, everyone hopes for its own, but especially the Episcopalians and the Congregationalists. But the returning good sense of our country," here he's talking about the possibility of himself being elected president, But the returning good sense of our country threatens abortion to their hopes. And the preachers believe that any portion of power confided in me, such as being elected president, will be exerted in opposition to their schemes. And they believe truly, for I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. But this is all they have to fear from me, but it is enough, too, in their opinion.
I'm very honored to get the dramatic reading there.
Yes.
But,
I love it.
Well, yeah, I mean, so throughout the book, what you discover these gems by going back into the historical record, and many of these do shed light on, when you find out what was actually believed and said at the time, they do shed light on contemporary debates. I mean, you write about the original view of what the Supreme Court's power should have been, the original view of the role of guns and limitations on gun ownership, things where the right in this country is always trying to claim the legacy of the founders of the country, who I think you would probably agree with statement would have been appalled by a lot of the policies of the contemporary American right.
To say the very least, yes. I mean, there are a few. Like I said, Patrick Henry would probably be right up there with Pat Buchanan, but he was the anomaly, actually, among the founders and the framers.
Well, maybe we could talk about some of those things. Like, I mean, for example, the Supreme Court, because that does come up both in your discussion of towards the end of the book of what we need to do, because you have a discussion about today, and also, how it's misunderstood.
Yeah, well, I frame all of the, or virtually all of the 20 some odd suggestions for kind of putting America back together in the context of democracy itself. These are all things that the majority of Americans support. And we don't have them because the Supreme Court legalized political bribery in 1976 and 78 with the Bellotti and the Buckley decisions, or Buckley and Bellotti, respectively, and then tripled down on it in 2010 with Citizens United. But the thing that constantly gets lost about the Supreme Court and about this idea that there are three co-equal branches of government is that the founders did not intend to establish three co-equal branches of government. The House of Representatives was very much the first among equals. It's only Congress can declare war, for example. All legislation has to originate in the House of Representatives, whether it's raising taxes or whether it's spending money. And in fact, Congress was given the job in the Constitution of creating the federal judiciary. And they had to do it by law. They had to do it by the Judiciary Act of 1789. And Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution says that the Supreme Court shall be basically the final court of appeals, except as Congress dictates, essentially. It says, except under regulation of Congress and with exceptions defined by Congress. And writing into legislation that this is a law that Congress can't, or that the Supreme Court can't blow up, actually has a long history in the United States. There were hundreds of laws that were written and passed by Republicans during the Reagan administration that had court stripping built into them. Most recently, the law that was just passed a month or so ago that resolved the debt ceiling crisis has a paragraph in it that says this legislation is not subject to judicial review. It, explicitly says the Supreme Court can't rule on this. So, the Supreme Court has seized power onto itself that it was not given it in the Constitution. And frankly, I think it's time for Congress to take some of that power back, at the very least, with regard to defining ethics rules and reclaiming the ability of Congress on behalf of the people to get money out of politics.
We don't have time to go through because you cover so much ground in such a short amount of space in this book. As you say, the last part of your book, you give us a full democracy agenda, but perhaps you could give us a couple of key points of the ways in which this, what you call the ancient way of living of democracy has been eroded over the course of our history in a way that you think we're not doomed to accept.
Yeah. Well, first off, the preamble to the Constitution, and also in Article 1, Section 8, the Constitution talks about general welfare, and the Declaration of Independence, of course, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that our government was created to create essentially a we society, not a me society. And so all of these things at the end of the book are things that, like as I said a minute ago, have mostly majority support. And there are things that would advance that cause. There are also things that pretty much every other advanced democracy in the world already has. Because every other advanced democracy in the world does not have a Supreme Court that has legalized political bribery. And so, having morbidly rich people pay their fair share of taxes, having a strong Social Security and Medicare system, having a national healthcare system that covers everybody at a reasonable cost and with high quality healthcare. Having a public education system, a primary and secondary public education system that's the world class, as we had before the Reagan Revolution. Having free college education or something close to it, as we had before the Reagan Revolution. Some of this is just reclaiming stuff that just got gutted from America as the result of 40 years of neoliberalism that was not entirely just Republicans. I mean, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama bought into a lot of this stuff too. So although Joe Biden is repudiating an awful lot of that, he seems to be going back to the New Deal and going back to these more ancient principles, I think. But it's basically, how do we live together and how do we have each other's backs? How do we create a society that works for everyone, not just for the wealthy few?
Mm-hmm. And, as we look over history, we see some proud examples from Thomas Paine onwards. One of the things that Professor Harvey Kaye has been on this program several times and has talked about how we as progressives need to have our own kind of narrative of the American story that singles out the figures whose legacies we get to claim because they fought in their time for the things that we fight for in ours.
Yeah, you mentioned Thomas Paine. I mean, I opened the book. The epigraph for the book is a quote from Agrarian Justice in 1797. He says, "To understand what the state of society ought to be, it is necessary to have some idea of the natural and primitive state of man, such as it is at this day among the Indians of North America. There is not in that state any of those spectacles of human misery which poverty and want present to our eyes in all the towns and streets in Europe." Bingo.
That's great. Maybe we could just touch on a couple of the other things that in your book that people don't necessarily, that you uncover, or facts about that people don't necessarily know. You lead part 2 with the Electoral College, which we kind of accept as a fact of American life. That too, more complex origins than people necessarily assume.
It's a fascinating story. The meme, at least on the left mostly these days, is that the Electoral College was there to promulgate slavery or perpetuate slavery. No. The problem that they had in 1787 when they were, negotiating the Constitution, and they wanted to have a president, a head of state and a head of government who was elected by all the people. But the problem was that physically from South Georgia to northern New Hampshire was a larger area, a longer distance than all of Europe, basically. I mean, it was just this massive chunk of land. And there was no Pony Express. The British controlled the post office and read people's mail. There was no national newspapers. We didn't even have the telegraph. I mean, we didn't even have electricity. Ben Franklin was still flying kites in thunderstorms and trying to collect electricity in Leyden jars. So the question was, if somebody in Georgia wants to vote for president and you've got somebody campaigning up in Massachusetts and New York and Virginia, how does that person in Georgia know who to vote for? So what they came up with, and they based this, I mentioned the Whig histories earlier that Jefferson was so fond of, which were the histories of the tribal people of the British Isles prior to the Roman invasion in, around 150 BC, as I recall, that they had an annual meeting. It was called the Wicke-Gemeinschaft, where people would travel. Each community throughout the British Isles would select a representative who would travel to this annual conclave where they would make decisions for the coming year. And they brought with them the requests or demands, as the case may be, of their community, but they also had the power to change their mind. And so Hamilton talks about this in Federalist 56, as I recall, that the purpose of the Electoral College was, what happens if, say, the people of Georgia vote for somebody and it turns out that person is a person of low moral character, was Hamilton's phrase, or a drunkard, another one of Hamilton's phrases. And so the way it works is you vote not for the president, but you vote for an elector who's pledged to a candidate for president in Georgia. And then those electors, and then, in November, the first Tuesday after the first Monday of the month, the vote is tabulated and the electors are chosen. And the electors then have a month to travel from Georgia to Washington, D.C., which is about how long it took back then. And when they get to Washington, D.C., their job is to meet the candidates and figure out if the person that Georgia voted for was, a drunk or some kind of weird person that shouldn't be president. And if so, the electors have the power to change their vote, which is why we have what's called faithless electors, and it's not against the law or against the Constitution. So really, it was, it solved a very real problem at the time. Now, by the 1830s, 1840s, we had telegraph, we had railroads, the early versions of them, the Pony Express, and it had become an anachronism. And I think it was in 1974, we came within one vote in Congress of doing away with the Electoral College because everybody just kind of agreed this is something that's just left over from the founding era that has no relevance. But then in 2000, when George W. Bush lost the popular vote by 500,000 votes, but got put in the White House because of the Electoral College anyway, and then tripling down on that in 2016 when Trump lost by 3 million votes and got the White House anyway because of the Electoral College. Now it's become partisan. And so now we've got this interstate compact where if we can get enough states to sign up, we can do away with the Electoral College. It's still going to take a few years. We need a number of more states. There are 205 electoral votes. They have to get 270. And now the Republicans have announced that even if they hit 270, they're going to sue at the Supreme Court to try to stop that because they love the Electoral College now.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that it had fairly innocuous origins does not stop you from concluding at the end of your book, explicitly abolish the Electoral College, which you call arguably the least democratic institution in our Constitution.
Right. Yep.
Well, let me conclude here by asking you, because your final section here is get involved. It is an exhortation to people. You're not just writing history, you're writing something that has the purpose of getting people interested in reclaiming and rebuilding their democracy. So maybe we could conclude with what you'd like people to take away in terms of the proactive message that is not just about, how interesting the history of democracy is.
Right. Well, I think the main message of the book is that democracy is in our genes. Democracy is a good thing, that there is wisdom in the crowd, that when the majority of the people of the United States believe that something should happen and that it's the best idea and it doesn't encroach on any, one individual or group of individuals' rights, that it should be made into law, that's what we should be doing. And the only reason that we're not right now, or the main reason that we're not right now, is because the Supreme Court has legalized political bribery. And that's, we've got to get money out of politics, which will restore our democracy. Jimmy Carter said this to me on my program 7 years ago. He said, America is no longer a democracy. It's an oligarchy, with political bribery being the first principle. And sadly, he was right, or largely right. And it's not that difficult to change that. I mean, the legislation, H.R. 1, the For the People Act, took a big bite out of Citizens United. It got a lot of money out of politics and had publicly funded elections and all kinds of great stuff in it. And it passed the House of Representatives. It had 51 votes in the Senate, but it hit a filibuster. And then, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, taking money from right-wing billionaires who generally support Republicans, chose to refuse to go along with Democrats in breaking the filibuster. But that has to be, I think, the job one in 2025 if Democrats can reclaim the House and hold on to the Senate and the White House.
Right.
Restoring our democracy.
Well, to find out more about the various proposals that Thom Hartmann puts forward for restoring our democracy, as well as the fascinating and hidden history of democracy, they should pick up the book, The History of American Democracy, Recovering Humanity's Ancient Way of Living, as well as all 8 other books in the Hidden History series, Hidden History of Neoliberalism, Big Brother in America, American Healthcare, Monopolies, which we discussed last time, the Supreme Court, American Oligarchy. I have to ask you, is there a plan for a 10th book in the history series?
Yes, and it'll be the last one. It's going to be The Hidden History of the American Dream, or at least that's tentatively what we're...
Okay. Well, we shall have to discuss the American Dream when that comes out. Thom Hartmann, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Nathan, thanks. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been an honor to share this time with you.
Hey, it was great. All right, cool. Thank you. I think that went well. I think we had a good discussion. We couldn't get to everything. I mean, it's amazing how, for such a brief book, this is one of the books that I managed to get through the least of the subject matter for, because you get so much in here.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.